Capitalism is anti-democratic. Capitalist societies are anti-democratic. Societies that are founded on the principles of private property and, the ownership of the means of production in private hands are anti-democratic. That's 100% the case. We've known this for a long time, at least socialists have. But I think increasingly people are realizing just the immense power owners of capital, bosses, managers even to some degree, have over their daily lives, have over our economic processes, have over, the entire fates of regions and communities, have over our systems of information, have over our systems of governance. And the reality is, we don't live in a democracy. Even people who live in some of the quote-unquote most democratic and wealthy and free societies in the world, Canada, the United States, nations like these, we don't live in a democratic society. And so there's this great piece in Jacobin that just came out, which basically argues that, capitalism, doesn't provide freedom. It's a farce. And I really feel this is something that leftists of all varieties really need to start emphasizing. Because most people, who, when exposed to this idea of socialism versus capitalism, will often interpret that as freedom versus government oversight. They'll interpret capitalism on the side of freedom and democracy, and socialism on the side of autocracy and restriction and control. And of course, most people will side with the former, especially because they have an idealized version of what freedom means and what democracy means, even if those things as they exist in the practical real world are grayer and perhaps less romantic. So they'll side with that, and that's been an effective tool of capitalism really for the last 100 years and more, to associate itself with freedom of exchange of values and ideas and these sorts of things that supposedly reify and reflect the human spirit, and associate those sorts of things with stultifying bureaucracy and with the crushing of human individuality and creativity and spirit. And the capitalists were successful at doing so. But the mask is off. The mask is off for the first time in a long time. And I think the left really needs to emphasize, really needs to push back. We need to seize this moment. So when we talk about socialism, we have to make it inseparable from the concepts of democracy. Because what socialism is, at its core, is the radical democratization of our entire society. It includes things like making it easier to vote. It includes things like making government more responsive to regular voters, to working and middle-class voters. That's a big part of it. Can't be sidestepped, especially when, as we've seen, especially in the United States, populations often based on class and race and other factors are systematically disenfranchised. So any socialist program would have to democratize the formal, electoral process. But more than that, socialism is bringing democracy to the workplace. Socialism is bringing democracy to our big economic questions. Socialism is bringing democracy to the ownership of the means of production. Maybe not from, mom and pops, maybe not including mom and pops necessarily. Although I think at the smaller level, cooperative industry, cooperative ownership, worker ownership is a viable alternative towards, mom and pop shops, which can still be quite exploitative to their workers. But certainly, we need to talk about the ownership of the means of production, the ownership of key utilities, of key national resources, being autocratic when held in private hands. When our telecommunications, our banking, our, oil, our nuclear materials, any sorts of these things, our minerals, all held in private hands, that is an affront to democracy, because it means that the commanding heights of the economy are not controlled democratically by the people most affected by the utilization of those resources. And so in a sense, this is a golden moment here. We know people support democracy. If you did a poll of the average person in Canada or the United States and asked them, democracy, for or against, I would find it very, very unlikely that you'd see any substantive support for, the anti-democratic position. So it's very clear. We need to examine how to show regular voters, regular people, that one man having $100 billion, or that a few dozen people having more wealth than the bottom half of humanity, that's not democratic. That is an unfair concentration of wealth, not only in a moral sense, but it is a concentration of wealth that distorts not just the division of wealth, of course, but it distorts economic power and distorts political power and distorts intellectual power and distorts cultural power. And if we want a democratic society, we need a socialist society. That's the truth. And we really need to be hammering that home. We need to make capitalism associated with autocracy, with, surveillance of workers, with a sort of inequality that leaves people with this sort of technical freedom, but, it's a freedom to starve on the streets, but it's not the sort of freedom that only exists, as Bernie Sanders has said, and even as FDR said, that only exists when your basic human needs and dignities are guaranteed, that you're not free without food and shelter and work and education. You're never free without those things. Even if no one's forcing you to sit in a cage, or no one's forcing you to go to a certain place at a designated time, you're not free. You're not free at all. We need to associate capitalism with that lack of freedom for the majority of people. This system of direct and indirect coercion, which rules people's lives. And we need to highlight the democratic potential of socialism. That it, at the end of the day, is the only way forward to build a democratic society, where workers, through the state, through community, through cooperative, and through worker ownership, can manage the economy, where our government is more responsive to the needs and desires of the people, where we have mechanisms to ensure that the concentration of wealth, both in and of itself, but especially as it pertains to generational transfers of wealth, is mitigated, if not eliminated, because that's what was required to build not only a democracy, but to highlight the essential value of equality of opportunity that we so hold dear. Right? If we really hold that dear, we need to emphasize that the inequalities of wealth are incompatible with that. So it's time to change the narrative. It's time to do that. And the left has that opportunity. The association of capitalism to democracy is weakening. In this post-Soviet era, that distinction doesn't have the same weight it once did. And so now socialism has to take up the mantle of democracy and of freedom.